And I find it very frustrating that how sclerotic the South African state is. I think President Ramaphosa, who I admire, wants to do more things, but it's as if he presses buttons and nothing happens at the end of it.
Here we go. Hello, my name is Solly Moeng. Welcome to the number one media company, WorldView. This is where we explore everyone's perspectives on all things that matter in order to expand our worldview. Today, we speak to no other than Lord Peter Hain. He wants me to call him Peter, but I'll do my best. It's very hard to introduce Lord Peter Haines because he's done so much over so many years. He was born in Kenya of South African parents who were activists against apartheid. He came to South Africa. He was completely active. He's been active even when he went to the UK, where he was MP for 24 years. He served as Secretary of State for Wales and he's in Leith. And he's occupied a lot of interesting positions in the UK government. He's also served under the governments of both Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. He has acted against South Africa. Even in those positions, he has continued to speak out against all the wrongs in South Africa. He was there also when Tony Blair and George W. Bush invaded Iraq. I'm interested to know what his views were and whether or not what is going on in Russia right now, in Ukraine, might end up the same way that America ended its journey in Afghanistan. So there's so much to talk about. Of course, I'm interested to know what his views are on South Africa. He has written 24 books. I have no idea where he finds the time to write 24 books. The latest of which is the Pretoria Boy. It says, what is it called? South Africa? And the Pretoria Boy, South Africa's number one enemy. Public number one enemy. So I'm interested to know about it as well. State capture, Ramaphosa, Zuma. Where are we? Now, let me stop because you see, it's going to take me the whole time to introduce Lord Peter Haines. Peter, welcome.
Thank you very much, Solly. It's good to talk.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate you having accepted to come and talk to us here. Let's start with you because it makes sense. It helps to frame the conversation. Who is Peter Haines or Lord Peter Haines?
Well, as my memoir published recently by Jonathan Ball in South Africa explains, I was a Pretoria boy, brought up in Pretoria of South African parents. My dad born in Durban, my mother in Port Alfred, and had an unusual childhood for a white youngster in those days in the late 1950s and early 1960s, because my parents, unlike my relatives, my cousins, my school friends, anybody that I had anything to do with, my parents were anti-apartheid activists, very unusual in the white community at that stage. And we experienced the full power of the police state, the repressive apartheid apparatus. They were jailed, they were issued with banning orders, and eventually we were forced into exile in Britain when I was 16.
Hello, everyone. If you're interested in advertising on WorldView, drop us an email at worldview.help@gmail.com. We will send you an advertisement guide, which will include the rates and the process involved. A typical shout out for your company or project will be between 45 and 60 seconds. By advertising on our platform, you'll be supporting a company that wants to improve the public narrative. Once again, send us an email at worldview.help@gmail.com, which you can also find in the description below. Now, back to the interview.
You did discuss politics with your parents? Were you, at your age as a teenager, were you acutely aware of what was going on? Did you have friends of your age who were also aware but disagreed with your maybe perspectives on what was going on?
Well, there was politics in our family. We couldn't escape it even if we wanted to, and I certainly didn't. I was proud of what my parents did, and I'd help them in whatever way I could. Putting leaflets through doors during an election campaign in Pretoria, for example, when the Liberal Party of South Africa, which they were members, by the early 1960s, when the African National Congress was banned, the PAC, other parties were banned. It was the only legal anti-apartheid organization left in the country. And in Pretoria, where we lived, which is, you'll know from your history, Solly, was the citadel of apartheid, was the seat of government, where the security apparatus was also based. Became notorious. It wasn't like Johannesburg, which was much more metropolitan and had kind of radical elements, although many had been jailed and made illegal. And of course, Mandela and the High Command by the early 60s were in jail. So they were the most notorious activists, and so you couldn't escape the politics with our house being raided, special branch cars at the bottom of our garden path, our driveway, following us everywhere.
So you first got elected as an MP, I think in 1991 in the UK. I mean, you got caught up in the maelstrom of British global politics, economy, the Welsh, the Northern Ireland story. How in the world do you manage to do all of that and still have a look over your shoulder on what's going on in South Africa? I mean, like, how does it work?
Well, I suppose because South Africa is part of me, and still, is a big part of my being. I mean, I was a Pretoria boy. I was involved in the anti-apartheid struggle, supporting my parents, as I explained. But then when I got to Britain, became very prominent, particularly for stopping all white South African sports tours, which is where the label Public Enemy #1 was given to me by the white South African community. And so, that was how I came to prominence. I didn't plan it, it just happened. And then, as you say, I became a Labour MP. And I suppose that the South African hinterland gave me a particular perspective on all of this. And when I was promoted into the Foreign Office to be the only British Minister for Africa born in Africa, and then into other jobs higher up in the cabinet, including negotiating the peace settlement in Northern Ireland, and having been Minister for Europe and covering the Middle East and so on. I mean, that I suppose has given me a broader global perspective on South Africa's position, Britain's position, and on the world as a whole.
And the South Africans never left you alone. I mean, when you became almost the face of, as you mentioned, the ban on South Africa participating in global sports, and the South African security agencies came after you. I mean, do you want to talk about that a little bit? What did they do?
Well, they bugged and burgled the anti-apartheid movement's headquarters. They arson bombed the headquarters of the African National Congress in London. None of these things were ever properly investigated, by the way, partly because the British security services were working hand in glove with the South African security services at that time. And then most seriously, they sent me a letter bomb in June 1972, which arrived at our family home. I was still living with my parents at the time, and it was opened on the breakfast table by my younger sister Sally, and suddenly there was this contraption with wires and terminals and all sorts of threats to us. And we were told afterwards by the police who took it away and made it safe that it had the ability to blow up not just me and my whole family, but the whole house. And of course, those were letter bombs of the kind that assassinated anti-apartheid leaders across the world, most notably Ruth First in Maputo, and the student leader, Abraham Tiro in Botswana, but many others. I was just very lucky that mine didn't go off because of a fault in the trigger mechanism. And then a few years later, something completely bizarre happened to me. When I was arrested for a bank theft in London, southwest London, near where I lived, very near where I lived, a branch of Barclays Bank, which I didn't even know had happened. It was nothing to do with me. And when the police turned up at my door, I didn't know what they were talking about when they took me down to the police station to keep me for 11 hours and eventually charged me. And that ended up in the Old Bailey, the Britain's Supreme Criminal Court, and I was acquitted. So that there were continuous attacks on anti-apartheid activists like me, but you know,
how did the UK or Britain become a home for apartheid leaders such as the late Oliver Tambo and Thabo Mbeki and many others, and also continue to work with the security services in South Africa?
well, I mean, Thabo Mbeki, as a young student, was based at Sussex University and then in London, and later, of course, grew to great prominence.
Right.
And Oliver Tambo went into exile when Nelson Mandela went underground in the early 1960s, and they agreed that he should lead the international anti-apartheid effort. And London was the obvious place for it, obviously being English speaking, the traditional links. And he had a house in North London where his family was based for many years. And he traveled the world, including out into ANC camps in Tanzania and Zambia. But I suppose because the British anti-apartheid movement was the strongest one across the world, and there were many others, of course, but it was the strongest one. So you had this kind of, in a sense, dichotomy between, on the one hand, South African exiles from the struggle, including my family, but also, of course, the very leadership like Oliver Tambo and Thabo Mbeki and many others came to London because it was a natural place in a way. Even though the height of the Cold War, Washington and London and Berlin and Paris and Madrid were all, though they said they were against apartheid, effectively collaborating with the South African apartheid state. Their secret services working together, and that's been well documented. Because the South African apartheid state presented itself as a bulwark against communism, very, very cleverly and astutely, and wouldn't support the ANC. The only Western countries to do so were Scandinavian ones, especially Sweden. Olof Palme, of course, its prime minister was notable for that. And so the ANC had to look to the former Soviet Union for arms, for training, for support, and for material resources. So the Cold War between the West and the Soviet Empire, that the anti-apartheid struggle operated within the shadow of that.
Yeah. So, this discussion about your continued link to South Africa is very important for me because there tends to be a tendency amongst younger activists in South Africa to think that people who leave South Africa stop being South African, or they start loving, or they stop loving South Africa, or they cannot be considered to be potential supporters of South Africa anymore. But people like you have left many years ago. I am currently talking to you from Switzerland, but it's a story for another discussion. How do you respond to that? People who don't understand, for instance, the role of Nelson Mandela. There are younger people who think he betrayed the revolution. He gave too much to the white people in South Africa. White people who leave South Africa do not love South Africa, or they don't want to be part of the new South Africa. But there are maybe millions of South Africans in the vast diaspora around the world who continue to look over their shoulders to say, how can we do better? But everything that's going on in South Africa, the racist policies, the racist narratives by people like Julius Malema do not help, do they really? What do you say to those youngsters who think that you have to be in South Africa to love South Africa?
Well, first of all, I didn't have a choice. They stopped my dad working. We had to leave the country like many other anti-apartheid activists who had to go into exile. Many came back. We had made our lives alive in Britain. I mean, I married in Britain. I had 2 children. I have 7 grandchildren. So my life, because of the twists of history, was made in Britain.
Right.
But I come back to teach in South Africa. I teach at University of Pretoria's business school Gibbs in Johannesburg, and take a close interest. And of course, I was asked by leading members of the ANC opposed to the corruption and state capture under Zuma to expose the international complicity of the corporates to that. But when I look at South African politics and the argument that the struggle was betrayed by Nelson Mandela, I think that that's a misreading of history of a very serious kind. Apart from the fact that Mandela and his fellow leadership comrades, Ahmed Kathrada, Govan Mbeki, Walter Sisulu being perhaps the main ones, they gave up a quarter of a century of their lives and more for the freedom struggle, for the kind of South Africa with a democracy, with all its imperfections and problems, a democracy where everybody can vote, regardless of the color of skin. That's what they struggled for, and they won. And when people say that, or some people say, a small minority say that Mandela sold out, they don't understand, I don't think fully, and I don't want to sound patronizing, but if you look at the history of the time, when the negotiations took place, the white minority still controlled the economy, still controlled the police, still controlled the army, the security services, the full powers of the state. Yes, they were negotiating with Mandela and his comrades because the whole future of South Africa was on the brink of civil war and economic collapse. They didn't do it out of the goodness of their hearts. The President de Klerk and others didn't suddenly have a conversion on the road to Damascus. It was of necessity. But the power balance was very delicate. And if you look at what the critics of Mandela seem to be saying is there should have been a revolutionary change.
Right.
Well, look at the revolutionary changes that happened in Mozambique and Angola, for example. Civil war for decades, the country's destroyed in many respects, landmines everywhere. Right. Look what happened in Latin America in similar situations. Drugs barons are rising, all that kind of thing. Now, whatever South Africa's problems are today, and they are considerable, and corruption and state capture, the Zuma 10 years of terrible destruction and looting have left a terrible legacy. But in addition, apartheid's left a much bigger legacy of inequality and poverty. And you can't change that overnight. Now, where I do agree with the critics is I think there should have been much more rapid economic transformation from 1994 onwards. But that's a very difficult thing to manage. And don't underestimate how hard it is. I was in a Labour government for 12 years. We doubled spending on the health service, doubled it. Double spending on education and improved, all sorts of, the railways, everything in Britain was improved when we came to power and under Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. And yet it was very hard because you're operating in an international capitalist system, neoliberal system, which is driving massive inequality all the time. And there's huge wealth concentrated at the very top. And it's very hard to operate as if South Africa is some kind of island on its own. It is in the middle of a global economy, and Mandela and Mbeki had to wrestle with that. Had to be careful that you didn't see a flight of capital and wealth and skills out of South Africa in the way that you did for example, in Mozambique and Angola.
Do you think those people who worked with Mandela, because Mandela was never alone, he was part of a team.
Absolutely.
In the early days. So many of these people, political leaders, they sit in the A-list of political elites, if you want, of South Africa. Some of them are still active, like President Ramaphosa. Others, like Trevor Manuel Valimusa, and others are retired. They're not in politics anymore.
They're not in frontline politics,
yeah.
No.
But do you think they should stand up and defend the legacy of Mandela? Because All these are texts by young, uninformed people about the intricacies of that period. They don't understand what was going on, but these people are still alive. They keep quiet. They don't say, wait a minute, that's not true. Mandela didn't sell out. These are the dynamics of the situation. Let's explain them to you. They're not doing that. Why?
Well, I mean, I can't I speak for other people. You know, I don't live in South Africa. I visit as often as I can. And I will be doing so later again this year to teach and to do other things. But look, I think I've certainly heard. I've heard people like Mabuso Misimang when he was alive, Andrew Mlangeni, standing, you know, explaining the situation.
Right.
I don't want to patronize people who take this point of view. That, you know, they're young radicals who, and I agree that the economic transformation has not been deep or sustained enough, and that inequality continues to rise, not just between, well, it's between those at the top, black and white now in the new South Africa. But I think it's important people tell the truth about history.
Do you think, do South African presidents since the end of apartheid take your calls? I mean, can you call Ramaphosa and say, hey, I'm coming over, can we have coffee? Would he take your call? Would he listen to any advice you might have for him?
Well, you know, President Ramaphosa is a busy man. I don't think he needs to take my call. I can have access if I request it, but that would only be for a specific purpose. And, you know, over recent years, I've met cabinet ministers and other ministers and senior officials to for example, try to recover the assets looted by the Guptas and the Zumas and things like that. And I find it very frustrating that how sclerotic the South African state is. You know, I think President Ramaphosa, who I admire, wants to do more things, but it's as if he presses buttons and nothing happens at the end of it.
We've spent more than 300 million rands on the state, on the Zondo Commission, state capture, at which you testified, I believe. The report has come out in bits and pieces, but it's out there. A lot of people have been implicated in wrongdoing over the years with Jacob Zuma until recently, during the period covered by the Zondo Commission. The National Prosecutions Authority has a head who was celebrated widely when she was appointed. We still do not see any prosecutions of those A-listers who have been implicated in wrongdoing. Do you think South Africans should continue to be patient, or do you suspect something is not right, just like many South Africans do?
Well, it's frustrating, Solly. Everybody's frustrated, but I don't think there's a lack of goodwill on behalf of the head of the NPA, Shamila Batoy. I think she wants to move faster, but she has to move carefully. You look at, for example, the way former President Zuma has used his lawyers to delay and prevaricate. A lot of lawyers are making a lot of money out of stopping bad people being put in jail, to be frank, for their looting and their corruption. That's not an excuse. But I don't think it's a lack of intention. I mean, you know, the former Secretary General of the ANC, Ace Magashule, has been arrested. He's no longer in position. Former President Zuma was jailed briefly for contempt of court. There are not many countries that do that to former presidents. You know, and for all that's wrong in South Africa at the moment, there's a lot wrong. And I'm worried about the country and the state of its politics and democracy. But there's a lot to admire: the Constitution, the operation of the Constitutional Court, the independence of the judiciary generally, the investigative free media. You know, there are a lot of countries in which this kind of discussion, and many others that I've taken part in on SABC or ENCA or, you know, Radio 702 or SAFM or any of the outlets that there are, as well as the print media, and of course the Daily Maverick. You know, there's a very is an independent media, and that's a good thing for democracy.
But South Africans want to see justice, Peter. They want to see things happening.
Yeah.
Zuma was not charged for state capture. And the fact that, he gets angry, he plays the tricks that he plays, surely shouldn't be an excuse not to be charged. The Justice Zondo, while he was he was chairing the commission, made it very clear that a lot of the information that is processed, that is in the commission, would be made available to the NPA. But the NPA is still making excuses. South Africans just want to know that there's equality before the law, that nobody stands above the law, irrespective of how angry they get and what tricks they play. They're not getting that satisfaction.
No, I agree. I completely agree, and I'm not defending the delays or any kind of prevarication. In a sense, well, I've said what I have to say about it.
Yeah,
I would like to see it happen much more quickly and for the country to move on. It's no good just having inquiries if nothing happens at the end of it.
Let's move to Russia. There's this war happening there. Russia invaded Ukraine. It also, in part of what it said to justify it, to justify its invasion, was that there had been atrocities in the east of Ukraine committed by the government that is now under siege. What do you think needs to happen there to end this war? Would there be a nuclear war? Is Putin so cornered that he might press that red button? Is there a way out of this for the world so that everybody would still be able to walk around with their chins up?
It's very hard to know at the moment. This is a barbaric invasion by President Putin, and he is the one responsible. The destruction of Ukraine, coming on top of what was done elsewhere in the world by the Russians and others in Syria, for example. You just look at what is a European country with strong infrastructure and skills base and, the bread basket of the world in many respects, its grain harvests and so on. It has been terrible and brutal and absolutely ruthless. But the Ukrainians have been incredibly brave, and clearly Putin thought he could, invade the country and run all over it and control it, and yet the Ukrainians, their democratic instincts have been very, very strong, and they've received a lot of support from other European countries, and quite rightly so, because if Putin wins in Ukraine, he won't stop. He's already talking about annexing Transnistria, part of Moldova, a Russian-speaking enclave there. There's Kaliningrad, which is another Russian enclave in the Baltics, and threatening the former Soviet nations that gained their independence and their democracy on the Baltic states, Poland, Hungary, and so on. So I think he has to be stopped. I also think that the West made some mistakes. I don't ever think it was a good idea to have encouraged Ukrainian membership of NATO. There was the Budapest Agreement in 1994, signed in Budapest between Russia and the United States and the United Kingdom to guarantee Ukraine's independence and neutrality in return for Ukraine giving up its nuclear arsenal.
So some form of Finlandization of Ukraine?
Yeah, some sort of Finlandization.
Protected by the Ukrainians themselves.
Yeah, so I think there were mistakes made, but nothing justifies the barbaric atrocities that Putin's forces have.
But how can he be stopped? He's not going to stop himself. What would it take for him to stop? Is he cornered?
Well, I don't think he's achieved what he wanted to achieve as quickly as he expected to.
Right.
So he's effectively had to concentrate in the south and in the east of the country, where in the Donbass area, for example, where there are large Russian speaking communities, part of the population there that actually are more aligned to Russia than in many respects than they are to Ukraine. There's also, of course, Crimea, which he annexed in a few years ago, and Georgia, which he invaded before then. So there are precedents, and Georgia happened, then Crimea was annexed. Now Ukraine is invaded. What next if he's not stopped? That is the question the world faces. And, there's been divided opinion in Africa, for example, for reasons that I think you can explain, but I don't think you can justify. Kenya has taken a very strong stance against the invasion, seen it as a kind of imperialist venture, which I happen to agree with. On the other hand, South Africa sat on the fence, as of a lot of other African countries, as China and India and so on. But in the end, you see, if countries can just invade others and do what they like with them, as Putin wants to do, that sets a very, very dangerous precedent.
Do you think South Africa did the right thing to sit on the fence?
Right?
Do you think South Africa did the right thing to sit?
No, I don't. I would have liked to have seen, a stance similar to Kenya's. But I also understand why there's an ambivalence in African countries who look at the West's colonial record. And of course, Britain was a big colonial power, so was France, so were other European countries, and say, well, not so long ago, you were doing these kind of things to us.
Right.
So don't kind of adopt some high moral stature with us. So there's an understandable history, and of course, in South Africa's case, as we've explained, as we've discussed earlier on in this interview, sided with the South African state. It was the Iraq invasion, which has been a disaster, and so people say, well, yeah, you are condemning Russia, but what did you do in Iraq?
So, there's one thing that really worries me, the question of leadership. When you look at around the world, is there anyone that you admire, that you think is a good leader? And let me tell you why I'm asking this question. When we see leaders doing the things that they do, whether it's former president of America, Donald Trump, or Russian President Putin, other bad leaders in Africa, despots, justify the things they do. So it's almost like there's no moral high ground anymore. There's no one to look up to emulate, to say, we need that kind of leader. Is there anybody that do you think about these things, about
No, I do a lot. Surely, I think you're right. I mean, we are plagued at the moment by very poor and often bad leadership right across the world. And that was epitomized by Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin and President Xi in China and Modi in India, Bolsonaro in Brazil, Boris Johnson in the UK. These are people who, are on the right and are not interested in equal opportunities for all, in conquering poverty. They're only interested in their own power, and that for their elite and their base. And yeah, we suffered very, very bad leadership. And I'm afraid when you look around the world today, it's often the smaller countries that provide good examples of leadership. I think of Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, for example, Mette Frederiksen in Denmark. There isn't much good leadership at all. And it's fantastic that Emmanuel Macron beats the racist fascist Marine Le Pen, but he's been very unpopular as well. And I don't think his economic policies have delivered for the majority of people in France. And this comes back to what I said earlier on about South Africa being in the shadow of this neoliberal state, which is driving inequality, breeding discontent, breeding populism and right-wing forces, scapegoating immigrants, xenophobia on the increase. And until you tackle that problem, until you get an international financial and economic system that grants equal opportunities to all, you're going to get these this bad leadership and this instability.
When you look at the world today and you compare it to say 25 years ago, 30 years ago, is it a better place?
You know, my dad used to say to me when I was a youngster in Pretoria, and I talked a lot to him, and subsequently, the world is progressing. It's getting better, he used to say. African countries are becoming independent. Colonialism is ending. Apartheid will eventually be overthrown. The United Nations Declaration of Human Rights applies. There's more equal opportunities for women, and racism is being fought, and so on. And democracy is being established in, not perfectly, but in more parts of the world. And it seems in some ways, in many ways, that that's going into reverse. And it just goes to underline something that I've learned in my life, and something that I say in my memoir, A Pretoria Boy, that you've got to keep, the battle is never won. The flame of freedom is never kept bright once you have lit it. You've got to keep sustaining.
Like there's an ideological balkanization of the world, isn't it?
Well, there's a dominant economic system which applies in China and India and Russia's in its own way, in a statist kind of corrupt way, and applies across the West, which is the neoliberal system where public is bad and private is good, and greed is worshipped, and I'm all right, Jack, forget about everybody else. And a small elite at the top is getting richer and richer, and everybody else is falling behind. Now, that is also against a backdrop where, you know, poverty has been, millions have escaped poverty in India and China, for example, and in Africa. So it's a complex picture, but I think one of the reasons you've seen such bad leadership across the world is that the old systems of democracy, if you like, liberal democracy, have not been seen to deliver in a way that they did after the Second World War for the great bulk of people. And you've seen the middle of society as well as the bottom. The bottom of society is always lost out. But the middle of society has been badly squeezed and damaged and hit. And that's why you've got so much resentment across the world and so much political populism.
I want to go, my last question for you is about South Africa. If you were to give one message from a podium to the people in South Africa, what would you say?
Trust in democracy, trust in the rule of law, but campaign to get economic transformation. I don't mean the radical economic transformation so-called on behalf of the Zumas and the Magashulis and the Malemas and all that section of the ANC and outside the ANC. You really want it for themselves. They don't actually want it for the people. It's to be able to loot again and to get on the gravy train again, as they have done in the past. And what you genuinely want is equal opportunities for all. And that's got to be the watchword. But at the same time, it's got to be done with economic growth and economic success. And to do that, you have to have a successful business sector. And you have to encourage entrepreneurialism and business competitiveness. You end up redistributing poverty otherwise. And so that would be my message. And just one final point. I see South Africa, because of my history, from a global perspective. There's too much introspection, too much parochialism in South Africa, that people think, well, if I take this from that person and give it to myself, the whole of the country will be improved. The whole of the country will only be improved if we all grow together. And then you can redistribute much more effectively and deliver a much more equal opportunity. Don't grow the economy, and South Africa's economy hasn't grown now for many years, mainly the legacy of the disastrous Zuma decade, then you get trouble, which is what you have in the country today.
Yeah. Well, Lord Peter Hain, Peter, thank you so very much for giving us this time in your, I'm sure, very busy schedule and sharing the words of wisdom, your views on what's going on in the world, in Russia, in South Africa, and hopefully many South Africans would have listened to this. And to our viewers out there, if you've come this way, of course, you've enjoyed the content, please continue sharing and liking this channel and get more people to know of it. And to you, Dr. Hain, thank you very much.
It's a pleasure. Thank you very much, Solly.